And also, when he returned home, he published a book titled 22 Cells in Nuremberg. And in that book, he described all of the defendants that he worked with, and he laid out an argument that these men, that people like these men, presented a danger always, that the end of that horrible, bloody war would not put an end to them, that the trials would not put an end to them. They were always going to periodically rise up and cause the rest of us trouble. And so he warned against this. He even made a plan to defend democracies against authoritarianism and Nazism and ideologies like it. And that was not well received.
Hello, I'm Zeb Baker-Smith, editor at Aspects of History. This week's episode of the podcast sees Phil Craig joined by author Jack El-Hai to explore the disturbing psychological drama behind the Nuremberg trials. After last year's adaptation starring Rami Malek and Russell Crowe, the journalist discusses his book, The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, the uncanny relationship between US Army physician Douglas Kelly and the war criminal Hermann Goering, and what it reveals to us 80 years later about the nature of evil. Drawing on personal archive material, what follows is a gripping conversation about power, personality, and the disconcerting idea that the 20th century's worst crimes might be rooted in ordinary human behaviour. But without further ado, sit back and listen into the riveting story of Nuremberg with Jack El-Hai.
Jack, welcome to the Aspects of History podcast and my home here in suburban southwest London. Are you in New York?
No, I'm in Minneapolis.
Oh, you've got up very early for this.
No, it's only 9 a.m. here. Not too bad at all.
Oh, that's good to know. Well, thank you very much for your time. And Douglas Kelly, what an extraordinary story and what an amazing book. I think at some point...
Thank you.
You describe it as a psychodrama at one point, or somebody, maybe sort of your blurb writers, but it truly is. And you run this two parallel storylines of what happened in the war and what happens in his life after the war. And we could talk all day about it. But I guess what I really want to ask first of all is this really a book about a man, or is it a book about a kind of evil?
Given those two choices, I have to say it's about a man, because I only write about people. Okay. I don't write about more abstract entities. So, and I also like writing about people in pairs. So Kelly and Goering are a great pair. They spark off each other, and you can compare and contrast them. And when I was researching the book, a big resource that I used was Douglas Kelly's son, Doug, who is a man now into his 70s. And he was just so wonderful to have on my side. But whenever we talked about his father and Hermann Goering being in the same cell together, conversing, we referred to it as King Kong versus Godzilla, because they were both such formidable and flawed men.
That's so interesting. There's a quote, I think this is definitely from the book, that I wrote down. It was the zest of high and fast living, of heroic play acting that appealed to Goering. Kelly himself loved that same kind of high emotion, fast accelerating life journey played out before an awed audience.
Did I write that?
I think you might have done.
Yeah. It sounds okay, so I'll take credit for it.
No, you did. But I mean, obviously nobody would say they were in any way similar. But the fact that they're kind of bonded through this experience at Nuremberg and the fact that they both died through cyanide is remarkable. And I didn't know that until I'd read this book at all. How did you get access to all the sort of personal, private papers that you use so extensively?
Well, it happened by happenstance. I wrote an earlier book titled The Lobotomist, and that was about another psychiatrist. And while researching that book, I came across this other psychiatrist's notations about having met Dr. Douglas Kelly at a psychiatric conference. And what stood out in this other psychiatrist's memory about that meeting was that Dr. Kelly was at the conference not to present a paper or to give a talk, but to give a magic show for his fellow psychiatrists. And that lodged in my brain. Even before I knew about Dr. Kelly's work with the German defendants at Nuremberg. But I soon found out about that. And when I finished The Lobotomist, I set to work finding out more about Dr. Kelly, tracked down Doug, the son, and asked him if he had anything from his father, that I was interested in Dr. Kelly's career. He said, yes, come on over. Doug lived in Northern California at the time. So I came over, and much to my shock, Doug had brought up from his basement 15 banker's boxes full of materials that his father had brought back to the States after Nuremberg. And it was a mother lode of materials that nobody outside the Kelly family had seen since 1946.
Wow.
And I felt very lucky and overwhelmed, really, to have access to this. But it all proved to be the foundation of the research in my book.
What was Kelly like before Nuremberg? What sort of a man, what sort of a scientist was he?
He was considered an up-and-coming psychiatrist with a private practice in California and also working with patients in the state psychiatric hospital system. He incidentally used stage magic or teaching stage magic as part of the occupational therapy that he thought was good for some of his patients. He grew up in California in a very pretty town called Truckee. It's at the north end of Lake Tahoe, this beautiful jewel of the lake. And but his growing up circumstances were dark. His grandfather, a man named Charles McGlashan, was the first historian of an ill-fated overland group called the Donner Party.
Oh, gosh.
The Donner Party was notorious in the 19th century and after for having tried to go over the Sierra Nevada mountains in a terrible blizzard, getting trapped there, and then starving and having to resort to eating the bodies of those who had died. And this happened very near the family property in Truckee. And so Charles McGlashan was the first historian of this group. He wrote the first book about the Donner Party, and he had a private museum full of all these grisly artifacts like finger bones left behind by the party. And so I like to say that Douglas Kelly had a dark upbringing. His mother, Charles McGlashan's daughter, was one of the first women attorneys to practice in California, but she had a dim view of human nature, and she believed that the world was a dangerous place. You had to be on guard, and she imparted this perspective to her son, Douglas. And but he was brilliant, very smart, rose quickly through medical school and into his medical practice. He was only 33 at the time that the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg brought him in to work with the defendants to determine whether they met the quite low legal bar of mental fitness. Dr. Kelly could handle a task like that quickly, and he did. But he knew that being there among these men who were considered the arch criminals of the 20th century put him in a fantastic position. There were scores of other psychiatrists who envied him for being there. And And so he decided to make more of his opportunity and to embark on a more ambitious study of the psyches of these men to determine whether they shared any kind of psychiatric disorder that could account for their crimes and other heinous behaviors. So he was working at the end of World War II in a series of field hospitals in Western Europe, treating soldiers who had what today we would call PTSD, and was successful with his colleagues in doing those treatments. So he had high standing, relatively high rank in the U.S. Army also, and that's what brought him among these men.
So you're 33 years old. Spending time, I think he's probably spent more time than anybody else with these extraordinary people who had committed these, world-changing, epically terrible crimes. And I mean, at the time, there was quite a lot of debate, I think, maybe in his circles, about whether there is such a thing as a Nazi mind. Was there like a pathology, had something kind of gripped these people that you could identify and say, well, that we now know that can never happen again, or, and this is maybe the more frightening alternative, were they just men, like any other person, who under the certain circumstances could do the most remarkably cruel, awful things? Did he ever come down on either side of that debate?
Yes, he did. He came in to his work among the defendants hypothesizing that there was what he called a Nazi virus. Of course, it wasn't a real physical virus, but a common disorder among them. But as he spent hundreds of hours talking with them and also examined them using the now crude, but then not crude, diagnostic tools available to him, he concluded that there was no Nazi virus, that these men were essentially normal. And that conclusion was really frightening to him because it meant that if they're normal, then there must be other normal folks out there among us who are capable of similar things. And he characterized these men as opportunists. Several of them were narcissistic. They were type A workaholics. He didn't use those words. And they were just ready. They were motivated for the most part by a desire for power and authority. That's what made them authoritarians. And they took advantage of the situation first in Weimar, Germany, and then later after the Nazi ascension to power in Germany, to assert themselves. Ideology. These men were, most of them were not big ideologists. The Nazi ideology formed the rungs on the ladder that they could use to climb up. But they were motivated by the personal demons of attaining power and taking advantage of opportunities. And so when Dr. Kelly returned to the States after his time in Nuremberg, this was in January of 1946, he came back with changed eyes and saw the potential for all this all over again in the U.S. and in other countries, and he warned against it.
Did it change him as a person in terms of his own behavior, his own interaction with other people? I mean, we know that most people listening to this will know that he ends up killing himself, and he ends up in what sounds like a pretty terrible marriage. Was that, in a sense, the result of his experiences in Nuremberg, or was he always down that path, do you think?
Much of it was the result of his time in Nuremberg, and that's because professionally, determining that psychiatry couldn't explain these men turned his world upside down as a psychiatrist. If not psychiatry, then what could? And he began, when he returned to the U.S., a gradual move toward criminology, a social science, hoping that could provide better explanations. And also, when he returned home, he published a book titled 22 Cells in Nuremberg. And in that book, he described all of the defendants that he worked with, and he laid out an argument that these men, that people like these men, presented a danger always, that the end of that horrible bloody war would not put an end to them, that the trials would not put an end to them. They were always going to periodically rise up and cause the rest of us trouble. And so he warned against this. He even made a plan to defend democracies against authoritarianism and Nazism and ideologies like it. And that was not well received. So that also was a professional injury to him when that happened.
Hello, Zeb here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben McIntyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also give subscriptions. Now back to the show.
And then in his personal life, as you notice, he had marriage troubles. He became an alcoholic. He was a very difficult man as a father, as the son Doug told me. And he became extremely depressed over the 12 years between his return and the day he took his own life in 1958. And so it was a lot of things, I think, contributing to his spiral downward, but his time in Nuremberg was a significant part of it.
Sounds like, his mother, you say, had a very low opinion of human nature. He, raised in that environment, then experiences Nuremberg and these men. Was he also, was he a public figure? Were there versions of the current Nuremberg movie at the time in the 50s, the late 40s? Was he kind of written about in magazines? Were people asking him for his opinions? Or was he a bit more obscure than that?
No, he didn't like being obscure. He liked getting publicity. And so when he returned to the U.S., the New Yorker magazine did a profile of him, a short profile. And other publications did. He went out on a speaking tour. He liked the spotlight and he liked attention. But also he thought that the message that he was trying to deliver was important. And then in his later years, he was the host of a television program about criminology. So this was a man who liked public attention, and one of his complaints at the end of his life was that he wasn't receiving the attention that he thought he deserved.
Well, you write about, and sometimes you go into the present tense, so things really dramatic and good. You write about his rages and how difficult and rather dangerous he was. I mean, he pulls a gun on his own wife at one point, shoots on the floor, I think. Mm-hmm. Leading up to the final kind of climactic meltdown. Do you think that was also a kind of performance in itself? That he just sort of like wanted to be seen, raging and shouting, and because there doesn't ever seem to be a really big reason for it. He burns his hand on a pan or something like that. Mm-hmm. What's going on in his head, do you think, during these moments?
I think he shared the theatrical impulse that you mentioned earlier that Hermann Goering had. These two men were quite alike, and that was one of the similarities. And so just as Hermann Goering's suicide by cyanide just hours before he was supposed to be hanged was a theatrical statement telling the Allies, you're not going to get me the way you want to get me. I'm going to do it my way. Dr. Kelly's suicide was a statement. He took his own life in front of his family using this very, dramatic, violent, painful, sudden means. And
does anybody know how he got the cyanide?
According to Doug, the son, he had cyanide in his home office, which was also a home laboratory. So he had a lot of chemicals up there, and cyanide was one of them. So unlike Goering, who took a capsule that had been issued to him by the German government in the final weeks of the war, Kelly did not take a capsule. He had the cyanide powder in a canister for use in his lab, and he put some of that in his mouth.
In front of his wife and son?
And his own father, yes.
It's funny, isn't it? Goering thinks he's cheating the hangman and cheating history and showing that he was in charge of his destiny. And you can it's twisted, but you can understand it. It's harder to understand what Kelly thought he was doing.
Well, it's a little complicated. I rely heavily on Doug's, the son's, impressions because he was there and he knew his father very well. And he believes that his father was was not thinking clearly, but was trying to make a shock to his family. And that when impulsively after an argument with his wife, he went up to his home lab, brought down the cyanide, made this barely coherent statement, and then put the cyanide in his mouth. Doug thinks his dad was surprised that he had actually done it and poisoned himself. And I wouldn't think that the expression on anyone's face who had ingested cyanide would look good. But Doug, the son, says that his father's face expressed shock, surprise. Who knows? And Doug was only 10 years old at the time. But it was a stagey way of making a statement to his family.
Change the subject slightly, going back to the movie, because I told my wife I was speaking to you about 10 minutes ago. She said, "Oh, you must ask me about the film." Of course I'm going to ask about the film. I mean, do you think the film captures the Goering-Kelly relationship well?
I do. I'm overall pleased with the film, and I'm relieved that I can recommend it to my friends. Just as a film, as a movie, I think it's a good movie. The relationship between Goering and Kelly is hard to capture because it's nuanced. Kelly never regarded it as a friendship because he was very aware of Goering's dark and dangerous personality aspects. Goering may have thought differently, and he really appreciated Kelly as an intelligent person who would listen to him, didn't make judgment for the most part, and Goering always talked about how bored he and the other prisoners were. They wanted intelligent conversation.
Right.
So, and in other ways, it served a purpose for Goering. So I would call it more in a match of based on admiration or affinity. They were alike. They both recognized that. They were both manipulating each other too, and they recognized that. It was useful to both of them. So I think that is the basis. I think that comes through in the movie.
No, I think it does too. Oh, that's so interesting. And I think that's very much in your book as well. I mean, clearly, Nuremberg is a large part of it is delivering justice, delivering revenge, delivering a public accounting for the horrors of the Second World War. But it was also an investigation into evil. And it was also talked about in those terms. And obviously, Kelly had his views and wrote his book. Have things changed in the 60 or 70 years later? Are the opinions of Kelly and the other psychiatrists at the time? Do you think most people in that profession now would say, yeah, you caught them right. That was correct. That analysis of narcissism, or have things changed a lot since then?
Kelly's analysis is controversial, I think, for a number of reasons. One is that the tools he used to diagnose the German defendants, or put better, that he used to not come up with a diagnosis for the defendants are not used in that way anymore. The Rorschach ink blot test, for instance, Kelly and his contemporaries used it often to diagnose psychiatric illness, and it's not used that way anymore. It's considered too primitive for that. And then there were others at the time, so in the 1940s, who disagreed with Kelly. One of them was a psychologist who was also worked among the prisoners, Gustav Gilbert, and he believed that there were some psychiatric disorders at play among the defendants. But Kelly's findings and his Rorschach interpretations have been looked at many times since. They're probably among the most scrutinized Rorschach interpretations in the history of psychiatry. And in the most recent one, which was maybe 20 years ago, the investigators looking at it came down on Kelly's side. They did not find signs of psychiatric disease in the responses. So, yeah, there's controversy, but there's also some agreement with Kelly.
And what about your own experience of doing this project? I've written about the Holocaust. Many writers have. It's still sometimes hard just to read and to imagine some of the things that are put before you. Did you find this experience? I mean, I guess after lobotomy, you're probably quite experienced at dealing with, traumatic storylines. But how did it change you as a writer? Because I guess it must have done a little bit.
Well, it got me thinking myself about the nature of evil, not something that I had put a lot of thought into previously, because it seemed to me a pointless exercise. People do evil things or they don't, and what's the interest in finding out what exactly is motivating or driving the people who commit these crimes? But Kelly, researching Kelly, writing about his life, convinced me of his point of view, that it was important, because if these men are not madmen or monsters, if they're humans like the rest of us, that means they are motivated by human motivations. And unless we understand what those are, we're handicapped in trying to stop them in the future. So he did persuade me that that is important. And even some of his recommendations for the future that he made 80 years ago now seem valid and worth pursuing. Now, one big difference is that when I published the book in 2013, this was a different era in politics and around in the U.S. and around the world. And so in writing about the right-wing extremists who the Nazis represented, I was thinking of contemporary people like that as on the fringes. They're not part of the main political discourse. But, of course, now they are part of the main discourse. And that changed the way the book resonates.
Interesting.
James Vanderbilt, the screenwriter and director of Nuremberg, he wrote his first draft of the screenplay in 2014 or maybe 2015. So long before that change occurred. And I think it's just fortune or bad fortune that the movie comes out at a time when that resonance is happening.
So interesting. I should say to anybody listening into this who might think from our conversation that it's a rather academic, theoretical book, it actually really isn't. I mean, there is a lot of that in it, but it's really immediate. There's a lot of narrative drives, a lot of intense emotional material. I mean, I doff my hat to you as a writer to the way you bring these people to life. And I think anybody who picks this up will not only learn, but they'll be gripped as well.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I should mention, I'm not a historian. I'm a journalist who likes to write history narratives. And so what I do, maybe it's, I think, different from how many historians operate, is I'll do my deep research, and I try and find the story that's in there. I'm, at least at the beginning, less interested in analysis and writing about movements and things that are not people. And so I try to identify the story and carry it through to an ending that is satisfying somehow.
You certainly do with this book, and I hope with the film and everything, it has a very satisfying second launch or relaunch or whatever the word is. And good luck with it. And thank you very much for your time today. I'll let you go and have breakfast now.
Okay. Thanks so much, Phil. It was very good talking with you.
All the best, Jack. Thanks a lot, mate. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family and keep your eyes peeled for new episodes. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.